The king. We all know kings. They even exist today. At that time, it was probably the most unifying political and religious principle of a collectivity that would be called a kingdom. Definitely, a kingdom could be composed by several nations, not in the modern sense of the day of the word. The word nation precedes for many centuries our concept of the nation state that is, I would say, an entity that includes and involves different ethnicities in some cases, or a unifying huge ethnicity through several regions and territories. That's not the concept of nation at that time. In the Middle Ages, the concept of nation was archaic, was ancient, was directly related to the notion of nation in Rome. The word natio comes from Latin for one reason. So kingdoms could be multinational, but the basis of their unity was the figure and the principle of the king. And in order to stay in power, the king and the realm of the state that supported him, the nobility, they had to argue that they had the sovereign right granted by God to rule, because they were supposed to carry out the word of Christ through their political command, taking care of the totality of their subjects. So the political system at that time, called feudalism, was based on a structure that had to do more with religious belief than anything else. The supporters of the king were the knights, the noblemen who had the privilege and obviously the money and the power to buy weapons, horses, hire armies, and carry out military actions on behalf of the king. These nobles also disputed some privileges and recognition from the king, and they were named dukes, marquises, barons, and so on. This is how our modern sense of aristocracy come to be. Hierarchies within the nobility. This is the most important, the prevalent, the dominant, the ruling realm of the state. And as I mentioned, we cannot exactly talk about a social class because there was very little mobility at that time. What happens then? The king and his nobles usually lived in these huge constructions called castles. Castles presided over one territory. Castles were the point of reference when it came to where the power is located. Castles usually held a court when the king was residing in it. But obviously, many nobles had their own castles, and that's why when we go to Europe, we can find ruins of these wonderful constructions that took years and years to build, and in many cases took the lives of many workers. But castles were safe against invasions, were safe against the predation of external forces, and they held the military power for incursions in case the king or a nobleman had to punish a rebellion, for example, or when a group of people, some town, decided not to pay taxes. This kind of interaction between the king and the nobles and the subjects was common and was usually unequal and obviously very unfair. The knights also coexisted with another state of the realm, the clergyman. People who belonged to the church or to different religious orders, people who devoted their lives not to economic or military actions, but to God, praying, and in the best cases, applying, implementing charity and the principles of Christianity, which was the prevalent religion, something that also unified the beliefs of most people. There was only one church, one Christian church. There were some attempts of dissidence, but nothing that important. That only happened in the Renaissance with Luther in 1516. The centuries before, the Catholic Church was so dominant that just to challenge it could be dangerous. So the clergymen, as the second estate of the realm, devoted their lives, as I mentioned, to praying, to practicing charity, to carrying a life as Christians, but also, in some cases, to studying, to doing research on the past, to copying manuscripts, hand after hand, generation after generation, until knowledge could be consolidated in the material format of the written word. Because this was a world in which very few people knew how to read and write. Most of the nobles, who didn't form more than 5% of the population, most of the clergymen, around 12 to 15%, and the rest, well, the rest of the people were the common people who lived in the countryside or in small towns, and they were usually peasants. No? Here we have a scene of a tavern in Europe in which they are trying to have a good time. There is a priest sitting with regular people, and all the others who didn't have the means had to live with the work of their hands. Peasants were usually the majority, 80–85% of the population, living in many cases in extreme poverty. The inequality was tremendous at that time. Sense of social justice, of rights for workers, those are two modern ideas. At that time, the divine right to rule from the king and the nobles was the only reason offered to explain such suffering, such exploitation, such despise from the upper group to the majority of the peasants. So they had to live in any way they could, mostly through farming, through cultivating the land, small commerce, and in some cases, we have to see that, particularly starting in the 13th and 14th century, another group came to be, the bourgeoisie. Interesting. Have you heard that word? The bourgeoisie. It's a word that comes from burg, that means city. Pittsburgh, Edinburgh, Plattsburgh, and so on. City of, city of, city of. This is a word that precisely means a place where people have built houses, businesses, forms of coexistence and survival that are probably more comfortable and more convenient than just living isolated in the countryside. So those who inhabited the burgs, burgos, became bourgeois. And what did they do if they couldn't cultivate the land because they were not close to the fields? In many cases, these people became professionals. Merchants, physicians, lawyers, teachers. This is the beginning of a social formation that would give rise to capitalism later in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. It's a long process, it's a complex process. Feudalism gives room to capitalism gradually, until capitalism had to contend with feudalism for many centuries, until very recently. Only 200 or 300 years ago, capitalism becomes the most important economic system, the prevalent economic system in the world. Before the appearance of the bourgeoisie, capitalism was just a minimal form of economic practice. Very few people had the privilege to put their own businesses, for example, or to earn a decent living from their profession. Not by cultivating the land, not by serving as soldiers, but by rendering services to, in many cases, the nobles, but keeping some independence of identity vis-a-vis this aristocracy. So the estates of the realm, feudal lords, clergymen, peasants, are the three principal components of the medieval societies. The Spanish chevalier and artist Ramon Llull used to call them defenders, preachers, and farmers. The defenders were supposed to defend the rest from threats, external threats mainly. The preachers were supposed to preach, to disseminate the word of God. And the farmers were supposed to provide food for themselves and for the rest. Apparently this was a perfect system. Obviously, from our perspective, not so fun, especially if you were a peasant. But this is the way in which medieval people explain how things came to be at their time. And we're going to go next to one of the most important events in which Europe becomes in direct and obviously bloody contact with other parts of the world.